Okay, good afternoon to our audience in Guyana and North America, and good evening to those joining us in Europe. On behalf of Moray House Trust, welcome to this conversation, Will Oil Fuel Conflict in Guyana? Conversations were a regular feature of our program at Moray House Trust for several years. We invited practitioners and elders to share some of their experience and their expertise. This new series of conversations will try to engage those who've written about Guyana, to encourage them to explain some of the research and ideas in a little more depth. We welcome your thoughts and feedback on the process by email or in the chat. For those joining us for the first time tonight, Moray House Trust is a private, non-partisan, non-profit based in Georgetown and dedicated to promoting Guyanese culture and public discourse. My name is Isabel de Caries. I'm the Chair of Trustees at Moray House Trust. A warm Guyanese welcome to our regulars. This conversation is based on a paper written by Arif Bulkan and Alyssa Trotz. The link is actually in the chat. In it, they identify the pernicious cocktail of entrenched poverty and racial division, catalyzed by a politics of division that has characterized much of our recent history. Noting, this is Guyana's tragedy. Historically oppressed peoples direct their hostility at each other, while neo-imperial powers hide in plain sight and reap the country's wealth. They identify several historical patterns, such as the coexistence of parallel narratives, cycles of patronage and exclusion for those on the perimeter of power, a consistent tendency among the main parties to act as brokers rather than stewards of the nation's patrimony, a recourse to the courts to address intractable political issues, the refusal of the losing party in each of the previous two elections to accept the validity of the result and to launch an elections petition. Reading the paper, Wilson Harris's concept of the infinite rehearsal comes to mind. Are we trapped in some sort of infinite rehearsal to lay the groundwork for a less adversarial, more equitable framework of government? As is customary, this event has been in preparation for several months. Events on the international stage over the past few weeks have added a new dimension and perhaps greater urgency to the question we have posed: will oil fuel conflict in Guyana? As the invasion of Ukraine and the besieging of its cities unfolds, we have all had to pass the rhetoric from the reality, to weigh, for example, the emphasis placed on the strength of NATO's bonds and commitments with the apparent evaporation of the promises made by the UK and the USA in the 1994 Budapest Memorandum. To recall that while the media spotlight has been firmly focused on the sanctions, the so-called economic warfare, over $10 billion has been paid to Russia by the European Union for oil, gas, and coal. That estimate coming, by the way, from the Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air, and that's since the invasion began. There is much more that could be said, but it's time now to focus on our own patch. Arif Bulkan is a senior lecturer in the Faculty of Law at the St. Augustine campus of the University of the West Indies. Alyssa Trotz is a professor of Caribbean Studies and director of Women and Gender Studies at the University of Toronto. Sarah Barrett is a student practitioner of electoral policy and administration and a democracy and governance professional with the Democracy Resource Center and the International Republican Institute. We had hoped to have a second discussant. I haven't seen him yet, Derwayne Wills. So hopefully he may join us later. If not, our apologies. It's a great pleasure to welcome Arif and Alyssa and Sarah to the conversation, and I'd like to invite them to begin.
Thank you very much, Isabel. Did I interrupt you, Alyssa?
No.
Yes, thank you very much, Isabel, and it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me. Should I just begin with my reading? Yes, so this is from midway in the paper referenced by Isabel, and I have to say, Isabel, you did a wonderful summary of the paper. I think there's no need to read it anymore. But anyway, here goes. The reforms enacted pursuant to the Herdmanston Accord of 1998 focused less on the structural deficiencies of the system than on their symptoms. The constitutional and electoral system was retained, ensuring that a winner-take-all election would deliver an executive president still ascendant over every arm of government. Additions to the Constitution of palliatives such as aspirational statements in the preamble and enhanced human rights provisions were far too peripheral to resolve the fears of ethnic groups in the losing camp that they would be subject to political and economic exclusion. Guyana's weak economic base, volatile ethnic makeup, and unsuitable constitutional and legal framework have combined to generate enduring political and social instability. There has never been any reckoning over the violence of the early 1960s, leaving parallel narratives of that traumatic period unmediated and unassuaged, with each group holding on to its own version of injury and injustice, what Trinidadian sociologists wrote a read-up terms competing victimhoods. Meanwhile, successive governments have each embraced the unaccountable, enormous executive powers conferred by the Constitution, resulting in cycles of patronage and exclusion. Free and fair elections consistently deliver a razor-slim one-seat majority in the National Assembly, indicating monolithic blocks of African and Indian support for each of the two main parties, irrespective of their actual performance while in office. Such evenly balanced ethnic polarization, combined with separate narratives of injustice and exclusion, has been the perfect recipe for combustion, which is reliably catalyzed by elections every 5 years.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that first reading of an excerpt from your paper, Arif Bulkan. And of course, we have with us Alyssa Trott. My name is Sarah Barrett. So if you're now joining us on the live on our Facebook page, welcome to Morehouse Trust's Conversation Series. And in the spirit of this conversation series, we have the authors of our academic paper that we'll be discussing today that focuses on oil and how it fuels conflict in Guyana, and we're reading excerpts. So I will go on to read the second excerpt, and please feel free to follow along with us on screen. And once I've finished this, I'll pass on to Alyssa Trott, who's going to continue our readings, and thereafter we'll have some discussions. So, in 1955, 2 years after the suspension of the Constitution by British colonial authorities, Guyanese poet Martin Carter wrote that without racial cooperation in the face of imperialist power, we go nowhere. This warning resonates more than ever today, when deeply partisan and racialized loyalties obscure the fact that Exxon needs Guyana more than Guyana or the world needs Exxon. In an October 2020 report, the Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis, a US-based think tank, projected that Guyana's oil revenue over the next 5 years would not be enough to close deficits, support new spending, and build a sovereign wealth fund. It also warned that beyond this period, the prospects for oil and gas, particularly Exxon's assets, are bleak. As Guyanese lawyer and transparency advocate Melinda Janke has noted, Exxon is cutting capital expenditure and jobs worldwide in the face of declining prices and demand. So I will now move you to excerpt 3, and we have an extra here just in case the discussion goes so well, we decide we'd like another reading to expand on our discussion. But the mic is now yours, Alyssa Trotz.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And thanks, Isabel, for the invitation. And Arif, it's always wonderful to be with you. Arif and I have worked together for over several years on a number of issues, whether related to Guyana, in terms of the political and economic and social situation, whether in relation to work that Arif and Tracy Robinson and others from the University Rights Action Project have been doing on challenging many of the laws in Belize and successfully in Guyana, the cross-dressing law and the law outlawing same-sex relations in Belize. And more recently, some work we've started doing on domestic violence in the Caribbean. And I'd like to thank everyone for being here. There are lots of, there are a couple of folks on the call who are I'm really delighted to see and who are probably more, someone's mic is on actually. Yeah, who are probably more sort of competent to speak on some of these issues than us. So we hope that you will speak. I want to particularly sort of welcome folks like Janet Bulkan, who's done so much excellent work on thinking through the questions of extractivism, whether in timber and forestry and more recently in oil. And I particularly want to extend a warm welcome to Bertie Ramcharan, who wrote just a fantastic letter in today's Stabroek News titled "Objective Historians Will Conclude that the Guyana Human Rights Association stood at the forefront of defending human rights in Guyana." So before I read my excerpt, I just wanted to say that what Arif and I see this paper doing is just offering a provocation. We wrote it at the, we had written a column in Guyana's diaspora, the diaspora column that I edit, taking the position that, rigged elections, not rigged elections, is actually symptomatic of a more fundamental disease at the heart of Guyana's political system that we see in the post-independence era. And we were invited to extend this article in Current History. We were delighted to do so and to make it open access in the hope that it could generate conversation among Guyanese and Caribbean folks and folks wider afield. So this last one, for me, I chose because I was really interested in thinking about what are the spaces for politics outside of a competition for state power? How do we disentangle politics so that it's not always about who you're voting for? What are the spaces for organizing and coming together across our differences in ways that aren't just steeped in a history of political competition that has had such tragic results for Guyana? Only by building and carefully sustaining connections across various struggles and historic divides will the Guyanese people begin to effectively challenge the dominant economic and political arrangements that are reproduced via the politics of racial disunity. Reforming, which reading it today, I wish we had put transforming, this elitist and exclusionary political culture requires centering the self-organizing capacity of ordinary Guyanese citizens in their communities, homes, and workplaces as they grapple with the business of everyday living. Now that Guyana's most recent electoral crisis has receded from the headlines and the voters are no longer needed by the major local and foreign players, even as the usual patronage politics keeps turning on behalf of the few, this is the slow, difficult, but necessary change of work to be done.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that, Alyssa Trotz. So we'll move into our discussion segment this afternoon, and that is always the exciting bit. I know that's why we've all showed up. So what we're going to do is I would like to invite you to raise your hand if you are willing to unmute yourself to ask a question. So just raise your hand and I'll call on you. Please, as Isabel said during housekeeping, keep questions short and to the point, and then I will field them to one of our authors or office space for other discussants to comment. Now, I would like to, while we wait on those questions to come in, you may also use the chat. I would like to offer Arif a chance to get us started. So Arif, our first question this afternoon is tell us a little bit about, we've heard about where we are right now, and there's clear, succinct, and very, very valuable analysis in your paper on Guyana's current situations. If you and Alyssa had a wish list of where you'd like to see us go, perhaps over the next 5 years, what are the top 3 things would be on that wish list within the context of what you've described in your paper, of course? So Arif, I'll go to you first, and then we'll go to Alyssa.
So thanks, Sarah. I think top 3 is a lot. Perhaps I could just return to the one of the things I have been thinking about for a long time, and it's actually building on the work of Professor Rudy James. And forgive me, Sarah, as folks start to think of their questions, if I ramble on in the interim. The thing that I really wanted to highlight in the context of this paper is, so we've been hearing increasingly that Guyana doesn't have a racial problem. And I think, I mean, I'm not quite clear what that means. I have an idea, but we hear it intermittently. And, you know, I'm not sure that the evidence supports that thesis. But one of the things that I wanted to stress, Alyssa and I wanted to stress in this, was the fact that whatever our other sociological problems are, the legal system in which we find ourselves, in which we operate, actually is the perfect fodder for where we find ourselves, in that it's the perfect conditions in which our dysfunctions can continue to play out. Historically, we have never had democratic traditions in Guyana or British Guyana. So we were a crown colony for most of our history once the British took over. The periods, so democracy never thrived. Whatever you might hear to the contrary, Guyana was ruled, like many of the other crown colonies, from Britain. And so we never had democratic traditions in Guyana. So the colonial office, in other words, could overrule whatever fledgling traditions we had locally, and so there was never a chance to build that and to build on those traditions. And then, of course, we know about we know about the 1980 Constitution and how that cemented power in the executive. But even before that, our independence constitution, I think, was in its own way very dysfunctional as well, because of the way the executive was sort of ascendant over everything else. And that was just intensified, I think, in 1980. What I wanted to stress about the particular passage that I picked was that we had this opportunity in 2000 for a more radical break, and it didn't happen. So we kind of stuck with the main system and tinkered at the margins. So, you know, the fundamental structure of the society remained, the constitutional system remained. And insofar as, you know, we have a semi-presidential system, which it has been described by comparative constitutional scholars as, you know, possibly the most dysfunctional type of system you could have, particularly for our demographic makeup. It tends to, you know, it tends to lead to authoritarianism because it takes the worst of, you know, pure parliamentary or pure presidential systems. And in the main, let me just say, and stop me anytime, please, but in the main, what it does is that for parliamentary systems like Britain, you have strong overlaps, we know, between the legislature and the executive. In other words, ministers sit in parliament. So there's an overlap of personnel, right? And so the main thing you have is, the main safeguard you have is an independent judiciary and perhaps a split executive in the sense of a ceremonial head of state and the political executive, and then a large independent civil service. What we have on the other hand, a pure presidential system like America, you have a president, you have executive power and a strong president, but then you have a strict separation between what they call Congress and the executive. So power isn't concentrated there in one branch, because as we know from American politics, you could have situations in which the executive doesn't control Congress. But what do we have in Guyana? We have a situation in which we have an executive president like the US engrafted on a Westminster style, or the traditional Westminster style, which everywhere else in the Caribbean inherited on independence. So you have this strong executive American style president, but on a constitutional system that's Westminster. In other words, there are these strong overlaps between executive and legislature. So a strong executive president that controls parliament. There's never any system in which you have an independent parliament. And there are many ways in which our executive controls parliament, and a maximum president at that. He or she chooses the list. It's no constituency system where you're elected by the people in your neighborhood who can boot you out. The president decides you're in parliament, and he can take you out too with the recall law. So he's in complete control of his parliamentarians, his or her parliamentarians. And there are other ways in which I could expand on that. And then
so Arif, I'll ask you to just stick a pin. I think a pin. That was a great. I think that was a great kickoff for us. Alyssa, I want to open the floor for you here to pitch in, and I know I did ask for a wish list of 3 things. Where do we go from here, given where we are? But you can choose to respond to that or to highlight for your excerpt. But in the meantime, I'll read the questions. We have some questions from Janet Bulkan in the chat. Arif, if you could start thinking about these while Alyssa's offering her initial points. So Janet Bulkan is asking, let me just go up. Where is the leverage for change? Who has their hands on these levers right now? And in which direction are they pulling? And Alyssa, if at this point you feel comfortable tackling the questions before we go back to Arif, then great. Over to you.
Right. Thank you, Sarah. That's a difficult one, because I think this is why I was so, I think Arif's first quotation is so important, because before we can even think about what it is we are wanting, we have to think about what it is we're also up against. And I agree completely with Janet's point there that she just posted, that the despotic nature of Guyana's presidency makes constitutional change undesirable for any incumbent. What political party would agree to reform this system? So, and we see this so very clearly, all of the opposition to what is being described as the Burnham Constitution. I don't know why people keep saying the Burnham Constitution, since we're no longer in 1980. This is 2022, and we've had all of these elections since 1992, and we're still saddled with a constitution that arrogates to the executive presidency all of this power, that all of these parties talk about when they're in opposition, but once they get into power, they see no need to actually do anything about it. And I suppose folks had some hope that in 2015, the coalition that was formed between the, APNU, the PNC and other parties, and the Alliance for Change, which included disaffected members from the PPP and PNC, and that would have ushered in some kind of shift. And sadly, Arif and I had also edited this book called Unmasking the State, that was looking at the politics, society, and economy in Guyana between 1992 and 2015. And even in that book, we in our introduction noted that there was little shift, even when the coalition came to power, in terms of shifting those despotic or authoritarian characteristics that Arif sort of identified. So, I think I want to begin by sort of saying that these are the important continuities that we need to wrap our heads around. Both the kind of racial polarization that takes place around election time, that has to do with that competition for state power and that escalation of a sense of distrust or fear, coupled with this particularly sort of pernicious kind of governance system that ensures that whoever gets into power, there's really little to no incentive to actually be accountable, to sort of encourage participatory sort of mechanisms. And so let me just say very quickly, in response to this question in terms of who has their hands on these levers right now, I think, what we could go back and ask ourselves is, let us ask ourselves, where do we think Guyanese are today? And I'm talking about ordinary, everyday Guyanese. I've just come back from Guyana. And last week, Thursday, I was in an extensive meeting with grassroots women, Indigenous, Indo-Guyanese, and African Guyanese. The women were from Parfait Harmony, where the prices are so high that the Indo-Guyanese woman I was speaking to has to shop at Vredenhoop. So from Parfait Harmony, from Tucson, Vredenhoop, Georgetown, Madia, and Bartica. And we were doing, it's going to come out on Monday as a column in the Starbuck News, but they were doing price comparisons, both of the difference in prices in terms of what they were paying for basic goods in Georgetown, as well as differences for the woman from Vredenhoop between just last week and this week. So that, for example, just to give you one example, a small bottle of cooking oil that cost her just under $2,000 last week in Vredenhoop costs her $400 more this week. And it's $2,250 in Vredenhoop, $4,000 in Parfait Harmony. She spent $5,000 for a small bottle of cooking gas last week, $5,700 on Thursday. So, these are the everyday effects of this form of political governance, that in the context of the discovery of big oil right now, we're seeing escalating and deepening inequalities between a very small political and economic elite and the vast majority of Guyanese people, who are being put at each other's throats within the context of electoral competition. But at the end of the day, it is the working people who are largely left out of this emerging political and economic equation.
So just a follow-up question, Alyssa. So clearly, because of the economic and other types of challenges that ordinary Guyanese are facing right now, they don't have the luxury, and I'm using that word intentionally, the luxury of participating in decision-making processes at their village, community level, at the local level. Do you have any ideas on some of the things we can do? So how do we get, the woman you just described there from, was it Parfait? How do we get her, for example, engaged in politics at that local level?
I mean, I would be really interested, as I said, Sarah, you're on the ground at home and other people are there on the ground. I would be really interested in hearing what folks have to say. I would differ a bit in the sense that I wouldn't say that it's a question of me, for example, coming up with ideas or solutions. And I fully agree with Arif about the absence of these kinds of democratic traditions. And look, I think the big problem has to do, as Arif has pointed out, with the imposition of Crown Colony government, and then with the granting of independence, the attempt by the, we know the Guyanese political history, we know the machinations of US and British imperialism, we know the removal of the government in 1953 on the fears that Chedi was going to be some Marxist who was going to destroy the entire country, and then the machinations that split the country. So we know all of that. So I fully agree about the absence of democratic traditions in terms of this imposition from above. But I do think that there have been democratic traditions. If you look at the work of Walter Rodney, you look at the work of someone like Rolf Farley, you look at the work of, Clem Ciceran, historians and others who have documented from village movements and attempt to inculcate all kinds of democratic traditions, that they have been these kinds of practices at a grassroots level among ordinary people attempting to go about the business of everyday living, whether it's dealing with the floods that inundated the coast in the 1930s that brought folks together across racial divides and across communities to help each other out, whether it was the early riots of the early 20th century, whether it's the 1924 Rheinfeldt riots that saw dock workers going on strike with sugar workers coming down to demand that the British Guiana Labour Union and Hubert Nathaniel Critchlow represent them, whether it was Indo-Guyanese and Afro-Guyanese landless folks in the 1970s who got together to try to sort of claim land on unused sugar estate lands and develop housing for themselves. I do think that we have those traditions. The fact is that what we have to think about is how do we actually build on and multiply that in a context where the space for politics is so monopolized by this idea of the state or of political parties. And it's exhausting. It's really exhausting. And I think the tragedy for me today is when you look at the kind of toxic level of the debate in the social media, in the newspapers, it's violent, it's misogynistic, it's dishonest. And there's this huge level of intimidation that we actually write about. Arif writes about it in this wonderful essay on the constitutional production of authoritarianism in Guyana, and we sort of allude it as well in this other essay. The levels of intimidation, you know, in a context where, for example, the state still continues to bear much responsibility for the employment of so many folks, right? And where cycles of political patronage are related to the job you get or the contract you get or you know, how things can get done. That I think that is, we have to think about all of those factors that are acting to demobilize folks in ways that are sadly permitting the status quo to go unchallenged. There's more that I can say, but I'd like to hear from other people. And I see Bertie's just turned on his camera. Last time I saw you were speaking at the University of Toronto. I wanted to thank you for that letter today in today's newspapers, for speaking up and speaking out, and maybe invite you as well to sort of jump in here.
All right, excellent. Yeah, so please feel free to not just pop questions in the chat or unmute yourself to ask them, but to contribute to our conversation this afternoon. I see Janet Bulkan. Those are some great questions in the chat. Do you have any thoughts? And please, I'm not trying to put you on the spot, but I just want you to know feel comfortable if you'd like to unmute yourself to share any thoughts you have about, well, what's that leverage? I remember Arif saying, you know, earlier that there was a moment in time in 2000 when perhaps we may have been able to take this forward, to advance this from just analyzing what the challenges and what the problem is to an actual solution. Any thoughts on how do we get from where we are right now to taking this to action?
So I think there, in spite of the Constitution being, as Arif said, as draconian and retrogressive as it is, there are the possibilities in the system of local government, the neighborhood democratic councils and the regional democratic councils, the NDCs and the RDCs. But the dead hand of politics stifles both. So between August and January, January this year, I was in Guyana and meeting with some, grassroots people like as Alyssa did. And they would write, a letter detailing a particular issue, and they would go to the NDC. Some of them, learned, oh, there's an NDC office here, and go with that letter. An NDC is completely unable or unwilling to assume the power it has in law. Same thing with the RDCs. So even though Guyana is degutted of its middle class, degutted of the people who may lead and articulate and discuss with ordinary people, these are your rights, these are the directions in which you could go or we could go. In spite of that degutting, I mean, here I am abroad, so I recognize that people say that all the time. You people away, shut up. I hear that all the time. I think in spite of that, if there were possibilities for grassroots people or Guyanese to try to disentangle NDCs and RDCs away from political party control. I mean, there could still be political party nominees, but that they would see the value of operating in their own interests. That could be a start. I think, as everyone knows, between 1994, I think there was local government elections in 94, not again until whatever. Anyway, the political parties got involved. Certainly the PPP did, and managed to whip people into line to vote for, so that they could control those RDCs and NDCs to a large extent. That's not inflexible, or that's not sort of permanent. People can always rise up and vote for local, but they need to be educated, or made to see that this can be something that works for them. At the moment, people don't see that. All they see is if they are confronted with issues of graft and corruption, depending on which ethnic group they are, they'll say, "All man a thief." And their own resort would be, you're not going to leave something for them by. In other words, what $1,000 bills you are going to leave me, depending on the level of shakedown, whether it's a policeman or some other NDC functionary or what. But the corruption is so entrenched that I think working at the grassroots, as Alyssa does with Red Thread, is certainly, and making them see, taking back NDCs and voting for people and trying to use the power. And if NDCs came together, would be one way to go. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that, Janet Bolkan. So Mr. Bertrand Ramtran, do you have any thoughts you'd like to share with us at this point?
Thank you very much. Let me first say that to Janet Bolkan, that I remember seeing you so many years ago when the dark days in Guyana. And I've told a story. You told me I was visiting and you were then, I think, you were with the Guyana Human Rights Association. And you told me my father, when I was growing up, used to teach us manners. And now I have to teach my son, my baby son, to be a hustler. And in some ways, I always thought that this characterized the predicament of our country. And Alicia, I don't know if you're related to Dr. Trotz, who was the government scientific analyst when I was a magistrate's clerk at 17 years of age. So if
that's
you
my dad, and he's online. He's on the call.
Oh, well, listen, congratulations to your father, and I'm very pleased. He used to come to Leonora Magistrates Court, and we were so impressed. He was the scientific advisor. And Arif, let me say hello to you. Now, having said that, in an earlier session that Isabel organized of poetry readings, one of the interveners said that in Guyana, we are not the people. And this made a deep impression on me. And I tried to rise to this issue in an article that I wrote in the Stabroek News called "Defining the Essence of a Guyanese Identity." Why do I mention this? At the end of the day, however we analyze history and however we analyze our current situation, this issue of forging a Guyanese people, a Guyanese identity, is something that I think we have to work at. I spent 3.5 years in the Yugoslav peace negotiations in the midst of the war. And I was once having a conversation with the then president of Albania, Sali Berisha. And I asked him, I said, "Mr. President, there must be a key to prevent the violence that Yugoslavia has experienced. What do you think this key resides in?" And his answer was, "We must blanket Yugoslavia with the European Convention on Human Rights." And that leads me to the thought, I'm not telling anecdotes here, that leads me to the thought that somehow or the other, we have to address this issue of inculcating in the minds of the young from primary school the idea of the commonalities of the Guyanese identity and the ideas of respect and dignity. Now, one of the best experiments that I have seen in this area is the Rights of Children, the ROC, the organization that was put together by the Guyana Human Rights Association and whatnot. I'm telling you this story, and I want to address these remarks to Isabel in particular. Isabel, I've been thinking for quite some while that we need in Guyana a small booklet of 30 or 40 pages of selected extra excerpts from different parts of our literature that can be distributed freely in primary and secondary schools, that conveys the sense of a common Guyanese identity. So the thought that we have to inculcate this spirit of Guyana. Now, where we are at this present time, allow me to say so that I was a political director in the UN. I dealt with Africa for a number of years, and I've seen conflicts in different parts of the world. And I have the impression, Arif and Alyssa, that we are where we are, and we have to move from there. And moving from there means recognizing the following. Each of the political party wants to take power and to hold power. And then now your paper brings out that neither of these parties recently in government has made any kind of, how shall I say, structural move or structural changes. And that leads to the question, how might we induce habits of cooperation, and how might we induce the quest for ideas in governance? Today, the Policy Forum Guyana, I just received, they put out a statement about the shrinking of civic space in Guyana. And we need to keep that in mind. So to cut a long story short and to end, there are times when I have thought, might the establishment of a constitutional court in Guyana, along the lines of the South African Constitutional Court, might that help our country? In some ways, we have to help our politicians to move forward. Now, one last point I want to make. In your paper, I think that if I were reading your paper at an earlier stage, and I say this with generosity of spirit, I might have put to you the point that in Guyana, we are in a permanent emergency. We have been in a permanent emergency since 1968 with the rigging of the elections, and since 1992 with the difficulties after each election. And so here is this, I end with this point. We have to try to get out of this mentality of being in a permanent emergency. Well, there you ask me and you force me to tell you what I think. And Elisa, congratulations on your father, and your father, congratulations on you. And I'm glad you liked the article in the Stabroek News today, not the article, the letter. If I may tell you something about that, I genuinely feel that people of goodwill who have run the Guyana Human Rights Association for the last 50 years, you have these wannabe statesmen, and you have these so-called journalists, and you have these people. Burnham used to say, in Guyana, the small man is the real man. Nowadays, the real man is a small man, and we have to deal with this phenomenon. So anyhow, I'm done. I'm not going to say any more. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much for that, Mr. Bertrand Ramcharan. And I think that's a solid point there. So, Morehouse Trust, I sit on the board as a director, so we are noting that idea about the booklet. But Arif, I see you were really, really engaged when Mr. Ramcharan was talking there towards the end. Is there anything you want to add to that, or to respond to in any way to help us expand?
Well, I mean, there are lots of interesting points. Bertie, I'm in your neighborhood, Bertie. Unfortunately, I can't see you this time, but good to see you like this on screen. One of the things that Alyssa said that I wanted to pick up on, and I wouldn't date our troubles to 1968, is the continuities. And Alyssa and Janet are much more sanguine than I am. I think that about these moments of democracy, or these moments of or these traditions. I mean, it's harder for me to discern them. But having said that, I do think that that's, and the point that Janet was making, that's how we end the piece. And that, our salvation is not going to come from above. Our salvation is not going to come from politicians. It's not going to come from the executive. It's not going to come from a constitutional court. Bertie, I say that with respect. And why I say that is that, from all of these, what we thought were going to be watersheds in our history in 60, whenever we got independence, 60-something, 66, or 1992 or 2015, each time it has been a bitter disappointment. And what stays with me is Anna Benjamin's statement in her book about the birth of Stabroek News, when she says, you know, in 1992, because Stabroek News came about in what you call, Bertie, the very dark period. And she said in 1992, we thought things were going to be, you know, so different, and they weren't for her. It wasn't for journalists. So Guyana, so what I see is that we've always had weak traditions of democracy. We've always had, so even when formal democracy was restored in 92, we've always had very weak traditions. Civic space, the thing that you saw today, civic space to me has always been under assault. And so for me, the problem is, Janet asked where the levers are. And I do think the levers are in the local spaces, yes, but the problem is because of our weak traditions and because the state, I think, is so dominant. The state just, you know, gobbles up everything. And the state wields such enormous powers. So the state can favor and disfavor, and the state can, you know, victimize or reward. So, you know, it leaves very little, I think, civic space. And so while I totally agree that the solution for us has to lie at the local level, it has to lie at organizing with groups like Red Thread and Help Enchanta and all the new democracy groups that are forming, we do have to tackle the problem of this very large state and with all its powers. We have to have meaningful mechanisms of inclusion. Can I end on one last point, Sarah, which is that we hear about, you know, Article 13 and this inclusionary, this inclusionary ethos that's encapsulated in our Constitution, but successive leaders at the changeovers talk about this, and then on the heels of 2020, right after the swearing in of a new government, and said it's going to be a new government to the people, we have the technocrat Vincent Adams being terminated from EPA, and this is, you know, these are things that continue in each iteration. So I'm just saying this is the latest, but I mention him because we're talking about oil, and this is one of the most qualified technocrats. We were lucky to have him, but he's terminated because of his political affiliation, and then the opposition is granted one seat on the NRF, one seat, one place, and even that place they don't get. They can't choose who that place is. The government chooses for them. So this is not what inclusion is about. And so for me, what we need is a smaller executive that doesn't, suck up all the oxygen in Guyana.
Before, Sarah, can I just jump in before we just go to the hands? Because I know we were going to have some discussion before. And I think just building on Arif, indeed, I mean, we could look more recently. And Arif said we could look at the coalition record between 2015 to 2020. We see similar patterns, right? But the most recent was the letting go of Dr. Rudy Jadapat from the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative on the basis of an allegation that he was an AFC member. And then the hiring of Dr. Prem Mizir. And when posed with a similar question about whether there was a political affiliation, the minister was reportedly said last week, well, everybody has to be employed. So we see those kinds of double standards. But the point I want to actually make goes back to something Bertie said in relation to history. But someone asked in the chat about the question of race. Listen, race, with the exception of ROAR, which is Ravi Dev's party, which in many ways you might say is perhaps the most honest in terms of acknowledging there is a race issue in Guyana that needs to be dealt with head on. Neither of the two big behemoths ever really addresses or confronts that frontally. And if you look at the PPP election manifesto, for example, I was just looking at all the things they said they were going to do about oil. They said that they would immediately engage the oil and gas companies and have better contract renegotiation. We've seen where that has gone. They said that they would establish an arm's length sovereign wealth fund insulated from political interference. And we see where that's gone with the Natural Resource Fund. I mean, we could actually do a class on all of their various manifestos, both the opposition, but they don't have the levers of power right now. But what the PPP said it would do just on oil, we could just put that up and ask what it means that every single one of those promises has not been actually kept. But Bertie mentioned, you were talking about political states of emergency, and it made me think that we need to go right back. We can think about these long colonial legacies, but I think that we need to think also about 1953. 1953 was not just a state of emergency in relation to the suspension of the Guyanese constitution and the setting in motion of a tragic series of events that would lead to the racial turbulence of the 1960s, something we still don't talk about. And you remembering my dad was during that very difficult period when my dad was actually also a medical and handwriting analyst during the racial disturbances and was called upon to do all kinds of ballistics and handwriting tests during that time, something I didn't even know about because families don't talk about this period, how difficult it is, until I myself started doing research on this about 10 years ago. And for the first time, my dad started talking about it. But look, I think there's another crisis that we have to think about in 1953 that goes back to everything that we've been saying today. And it's something that Clem Citroen has raised, and I believe will be forthcoming in his to-be-published book on Cheddi Jagan, the biography of Cheddi Jagan. But Clem asked us to reconsider 1953. And he goes back to what he says was an entreaty by some of the senior members of the PPP. I believe some of them would have been folks like Ayusi Koyana, Martin Carter, Rory Westmus, who cautioned Cheddi Jagan and Forbes Burnham at the time that they would overwhelmingly win the elections and said this should not be the task, that would be actually not a triumph, but a tragedy. In other words, what they were saying was that enough work had not been done in communities with, at the time, I imagine the focus would have been predominantly on African and Indian coastal communities. Enough work had not been done within communities or across communities. And what the PPP should do instead for 1953, and this is something that Clem has actually written about in an article that was published in Stabroek News, so I can put the link for folks who want to see it, was that what they were advised to do was to contest 8 seats. 8 seats. Show that you had some electoral heft and then go back into your communities and continue doing your work. Instead, they went for all, won 18, and the rest is history. The focus became on the competition for state power. The focus became, you know, Martin Carter has a poem called Rain Falls Upwards. The focus channeled upwards as opposed to doing that slow, careful, everyday work in communities. And the rest is history. This is not to excuse British and American imperialism, but it's simply to say that that quest for state power was also something of our own making.
Thank you very much, Alyssa. I see that Ms. Vanda Radzik has had her hand up for some time. So I'll move to you, Vanda, and then I see Dave Modeste. I'm sorry, sir, if I'm pronouncing your surname incorrectly. I'll go to you. So Vanda, the floor is yours if you'd like to unmute and ask a question or offer a contribution to our discussion this afternoon.
Yes, thank you very much. Yes, so I just want to link the beautiful point that Mr. Bertie made about literature bringing us together, but don't let us forget that under the Burnham regime, the poems of Martin Carter, poems of resistance, were officially labeled as subversive material. And under the state of emergency that existed then, if one of the thugs or the so-called police or whatever came into your house or found you with it in your pocket or in your home, you were arrested for subversion in having Martin Carter's poems available. So, you know, this is just part of the crazy fabric of Guyanese society. But I wanted to come back to some of the points I think that Janet and others made and Kalina put in the chat. And that was, and what you also said at one point. So we now have in law that 50% of all candidates for local elections, and I believe for national, but I believe certainly for local elections, are supposed to be independent persons. Now, I know for a fact that in Rupununi, on the eve of the elections, when a young woman who lived there and is indigenous gave up her job in Lethem and stood as an independent candidate. And on the eve of the election, two high-ranking PNC or APNU persons, regrettably, came in, who held a meeting and directly said to the people gathered, "Why are you voting for Miss X? When the time comes, she could give you light and water and this and that. No, you gotta vote for we who could give you those things and who have the power. She can't give none of you job. This is where we come in." And that zero, she was actually the leading, when the polls were in, the polls before, this particular young woman was leading everybody because people wanted a change. They trusted her. She was wonderful. But after that kind of on high dissing of her, she came in last. So this is just an example. And what happens, I have over my career, I have always encouraged young women to step up to politics, but I do not do it any longer. The last decade or so, I don't do it any longer, because what happens is that they are so quickly co-opted into the same tribal, race-based, disgusting party ethics. And so their own independence or impetus gets lost. And then how many of these grassroots women that might join a party and they put their name on the list in order to pad the 1/3 women have to be on a list. And so many women are added to these two horrible party people's list. But then are they in parliament? Do they get to exert decision-making at the table? The answer is really no. Also, don't let us forget that the PPP and the PNC are massive mass-based machinery. So when they go out and people are stepping up, new faces, fresh blood, stepping up, they immediately co-opt them into the nastiness of their ethics and their race and their corruption and the rest of it. And this goes across the board of the PNC and the PPP and whatever formations they choose to describe themselves as. I would just like to say that I like the idea of a constitutional court. And this came up as a key recommendation when we had a constitution reform process that I thought was actually quite excellent between 2001, I think, and 2003. In those days, Haslin Paris, who was not a PPP, was made the person in charge of that commission, the writing of the report. The commissions were extremely diverse. Jean LaRose for Indigenous, Miles Fitzpatrick and Rupert Roopnaraine and Pandit this and this body. It was a real attempt. And when the hero from South Africa came with his one arm shot off by thugs in the movement, anti-apartheid movement, he also recommended the strength of a constitution that was known and held in the people's minds and hearts. And he talked about how every South African, I assume Black or non-racist South African, he said everyone had in their breast pocket or in their skirt pocket, a small version of the South African Constitution. And people quoted it all of the time. So when the Constitutional Court was established in South Africa, it was not made up of the parties and all of this kind of crap. It was made up of civil society and citizens, representatives across the board. And this is
so Vonda, yeah. So sorry, I think this is such a strong point. Could we pause here, because I'd like to ask Arif a question on the constitutional court idea.
But it has to be innovative, you see? It can't just be the same crap that we have all the time.
Yeah, I hear you loud and clear. So, we as a nation, all 11 regions, and I say 11 regions intentionally because the diaspora we sometimes fondly refer to as Region 11, you guys count on you, very important. So Arif, Dave, let me just ask Arif a question and then I'll hand the floor to you. But Arif, would you first, do you mind giving us an overview, just a little briefer on what exactly is this constitutional court idea and any thoughts you have on its merit? Could it work, and are there things that we need to have in place for it to work? And I don't mean to give you a time limit, but we have 29 minutes left. So if you could use like about 3 minutes to get that succinctly in, I would appreciate it. So yeah, floor to you.
You need to give time limits to Lisa. But anyway, so maybe you should ask Barty about this because he mooted it, or Vanda, but because I'm not sure exactly what they have in mind. I mean, the South African Constitutional Court is extremely prestigious, and it's, you know, there are many constitutional, the whole idea behind it that are courts that are devoted, so they have the expertise in rights issues and constitutional issues. Now, after 2001, Guyana did go this way in a sense, in that they have a constitutional a constitutional division, and it's only one judge who sits in it, and that's the Chief Justice, as far as I know. Chief Justice Roxanne, it used to be Ian Chang and now Roxanne George. They do all of the cases. Now, I think the distinction with the South African Constitutional Court and others of its nature is that it's a final court. They rule ultimately on all rights issues. I think for Guyana, the important thing is that, that we have, I think the important judicial reform for us was that since we abolished appeals to the Privy Council, that we now have returned to a third tier at the CCJ. And I think that distance and that composition of a third tier court, of a final court, that is, whose independence we can't encroach on, our executive can't encroach on, is, for me, that's enough. We have this tendency in Guyana, and Isabel mentioned it right in the beginning very succinctly, this judicialization of our politics, which I actually don't think that it's a good thing. I don't think the judges should be pronouncing on many of these issues that are political and social issues. I don't think the cure can come from judges. But it's, there's a lot to unpack about this, and I can't do it in 3 minutes.
No, I completely understand.
I think for me, Sarah, what I would like to say perhaps is that I think the good reform for us is that since 2005, we have the option of a third tier of the CCJ, which is insulated from political pressure. And for me, that's enough at this point.
Thank you. So I'm gonna read, I see Helena has left us a comment here, and there was a good discussion in the chat on local government and local elections, and we did touch on that some in our discussion, but let me just read this out for us, and then we can switch to Dave, and maybe we can come back to switch to our second excerpt, because we haven't talked a lot about Martin Carter's quote, "Without racial cooperation in the face of imperialist power, etc., etc." So I'd like us to put some time on that one before we close this evening. But Kelena has said, she's thanking Ms. Radzik for her contributions, and she says, I think that this just proves that independent spirits get crushed by the actual socio-political realities, while grassroots movements are extremely admirable. How can the grassroots galvanize more of the population? In terms of oil, there are people that want to see change in the contracts, practices, etc. But how do we focus the grassroots to effect significant change? And I think we're coming back to this again, where we're asking what the solution really could be to this. How do we mobilize grassroots? And I have some thoughts on it, and I'll also offer Alyssa the floor for any additional thoughts that she has on this. But for now, Dave, I'd like to invite you to unmute yourself. And do you have a question, or would you like to contribute to the discussion we've been having? There you are, sir.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for this to Morey House and to the panel. I think it's a really very important topic. But before I give my question, I just wanted to say a comment, which was that so far we've talked about a lot of the sort of existing problems that people recognize, things like the Constitution, the race, the politics, and all of that. But those things have existed for quite a while. And despite the efforts of many, we haven't really made the progress that everybody believes we should make. But the topic today kind of slided towards the impact of oil on the conflict. So one of the things that I would like to at least get some comments from the panel on is things like climate change, things like the pollution that comes from oil, and also migration. When I say migration, I don't mean just people leaving, but people coming into Guyana, and the things that have potential for conflict, like those that we haven't really been addressing, but there's a high potential for those things to also force our hand in a way that, you know, we don't expect. So what is the potential for those things, first of all, to be initiators of conflict, and how is not only the government, but other organizations preparing or trying to anticipate some of these new problems that could come forward in an even bigger way than the ones we face now?
All right, excellent. And Dave, your last name, did I pronounce it correctly? Is it Modeste?
That's correct, yes.
Excellent. So Dave Modeste, thank you very much for that question. So before I hand to you, Alyssa, I know it's a huge question, and I think the point, and I've read the paper several times from Alyssa and Arif, and one of the points I see and I do agree with, it's that because we're so focused on solving the entrenchment of the ethnic polarization across the country's institution, there's little time for us to focus on solutions to anything else, which means that issues like the migration issues, climate change, any social or economic issue that you can think about it, and you'll observe this in our dialogue spaces, when Guyanese people get together to talk about various issues and hope to move towards solutions to these issues, the one thing we keep coming back to is the ethnic polarization in our country. Now, as a long-standing history, political, and now current student of electoral administration and policy, the way I have framed the problem to myself, it's that, look, the ethnic polarization is a symptom and it's being driven by resource conflict, right, Dave? And I think that you identified a lot of those points that could further aggravate that resource conflict. There is one solution, there are many solutions. So this thing is not just like there's one entry point and you could fix it. Obviously, there needs to be constitutional reform. There also needs to be electoral reform. And then there are other changes that need to be made to the democratic framework and culture itself. And this is where we start to talk about grassroots engagement and political participation. Now, I'm 33 years old, and the only reason I'm sharing that is because I want you to have a reference point to my perspective. Now, you got somebody 35 and under come into one of these dialogues, they're not going to connect to half of the stuff we're saying. The only reason I could connect to 90% of it is because I'm a nerd and I actually study the subjects. But we bring young Guyanese who live, work, and exist in Guyana from regions 1 to 10. The average one, they're going to feel very strongly about many of these issues. They're going to have thoughts about many of these issues, but they're not going to be comfortable contributing to a discussion like this. And so when we talk about political participation at the local level right up, political participation becomes such an important solution. In Guyana, when we hear the word politics, is a nasty thing. I feel Guyanese, we're suffering from so much trauma, and not just Guyanese, everyday Guyanese, you know, our political leaders are also suffering from a lot of trauma from our historical hurts, which this article from Alyssa and Arif very nicely summarizes and gives us a good overview. Because when I read that, it hurt me to read it because you had all of it in one place, and it was staggering to begin to start to process that, right? And it's such a huge thing we have to address. Where do you begin? And my short answer to you, Dave, is that I believe that before we can address any of those problems, any of our social and economic issues, any of those challenges, what we first need to fix is strengthen the political system. And I think the 2020 electoral crisis provides an opportunity for us to mobilize in that direction. And while there has been, and this is an observation of mine, you think of any stakeholder group in the country, whether it be political parties, civil society, marginalized groups like Indigenous people, youth, women, everybody is in agreement, and we all here seem to be in agreement that there needs to be shifts and restructuring to various parts of the system, right? Those things have to happen, but what we disagree on is how we do those things. And we're disagreeing on process. Go ahead.
I just want to make a very quick comment. One of the things that I want to emphasize in this question is that although I believe there's a lot to what you say about what problems we have to solve first, I believe that some of these problems are going to happen before we have time to solve our problems in a specific order. So our hands may be forced. So we can't take it for granted that we'll be able to go A, B, C, D, and then get to this one. It might happen that one of these things will hit us before we're ready. And that's the concern. So I don't want to say more.
Excellent, Dave. Thanks. And I'll hand to Alyssa. So we'll do our round of closing remarks now. So we are at 4:42. So Alyssa, over to you for your responses to the discussion so far and any closing remarks, and then we'll hand to Arif.
I think you've actually answered Dave wonderfully, and that was really articulate and lovely and hopeful, Sarah. And I think, Dave, you're absolutely right. I mean, you know, it's not a question of if there's going to be an oil spill. It's a question of when there's going to be an oil spill. And will it be on the scale of the Macondo well blowout? And what does it mean that Exxon has only been asked to put down $2 billion for insurance? Janet will correct me if I'm wrong, when Macondo took over $60 billion to clean up, and not even clean up properly. What does it mean that some reports say that by 2030, that's 8 years from now, Guyana's low-lying coast, where everyone, including the Pradoville residents, have their homes, will be inundated with floodwaters? We're already seeing that now. I mean, I was just home and there were rains. I mean, March rains, like ridiculous rains, people's crops being flooded out in Mahaica and other places. So we're already seeing the effects of climate change without any kind of proper environmental audit for Exxon. You raised the question of migration, not only the out migration. Guyana has the highest rate in the world of folks who have gone beyond secondary education. I believe it's in the mid-90s, 90% of Guyanese with tertiary level education have migrated. But also, as you pointed out, not just migration into Guyana, but the uneven treatment. So the treatment of refugees coming from Venezuela, trying to escape the political and economic situation there, and the kind of treatment that they're being exposed. And we saw some of the distressing reports last week in the newspapers, for example, or the treatment of Haitians who actually have a right to travel as they're, you know, Haiti is a full member of CARICOM, and under the freedom of movement provisions, they should have a right to travel and to be allowed to enter into Guyana and given 6 months entry like other CARICOM citizens. The treatment of Haitians in Venezuela is very different from the treatment of expats and those folks coming into work with the various oil companies and the various other outfits that are coming into Guyana. Raises all kinds of other questions about the introduction of, or the reintroduction of all kinds of hierarchical relations between Guyanese and those who are coming in now with oil companies that are given extravagant salaries by Guyanese standards, companies that are not paying taxes as opposed to what Guyanese have to deal with. So obviously, I think those increasing inequalities are going to generate and breed all kinds of resentments. And that's why I began with this kind of time use and household budget work that these Indian, African, and Amerindian women are doing from around the country right now, trying to show Guyanese, well, you know, we don't know much about this big oil. The Jamaican economist Norman Gervin, who had worked on years ago on the economic partnership agreement, we don't have time to get into that now, but wrote a paper saying the reason that all these things are flying over the heads of ordinary people of the Caribbean are that they engage in three things. One was treatification. So they tie all of this sort of thing up in these big fancy treaties. And we allude a bit of this here. Again, Janet is the person who can speak to this. But, you know, the 2016 production sharing agreement that has all of these cop-out clauses that ensures that Exxon doesn't have to suffer any material adverse material losses if there's any change in the contract with the Guyana government. Norman also talks about sweetification, which is a kind of carrot, the little carrots that are thrown out to bribe populations. And we see this in the greenwashing. It's not just the governments, it's the greenwashing of the oil companies that are, giving little pots of money to do a little educational thing here and a little, when in fact they are running away with the bulk of their resources that they are extracting from Guyana. And then the last one is called technification, which is what Sarah was speaking about just now, which is this highfalutin language. This morning, Penelope Howell from Covidon actually issued a second complaint. It expires tomorrow in response to this attempted site waste treatment plants in a residential community, Covidon, on the coast of Guyana, has not gotten any responses. And in fact, this is continuing to happen without consultation, without any kind of due process. So I think these are the urgencies, the environmental disasters, you're quite right, Dave, the uneven way in which migration is treated, and it's racially and regionally uneven, because the way in which Venezuelan and Haitians are being treated is very different from those who are coming in to work with the oil companies, for example. And then just the increasing inequalities as a result of this efflorescence of economic activity with the discovery of oil, and of course all of this excitement now in relation to what are the potential effects on the Guyanese economy of the disastrous situation in Russia and the Ukraine. And then what we have, as we are at each other's throats, a contract that the PPP promised to renegotiate when it was in opposition has not negotiated. A national resource fund that it said it would have to deal with because fine, the coalition did that after the vote of no confidence, but they come into power and ram it through with little to no consultation. And as Arif has pointed out, where the president is now, there's a critique about ministerial responsibility in the previous Natural Resource Fund Act, that power now goes to the president in the context of what Arif has pointed out, the authoritarian and despotic powers that are granted the president in the context of the Guyanese constitution. And so many other things that one could speak of. Those, I think, are the very real dangers of us not getting our act together, is that we are in the latest round of extractivism, where it is the Guyanese people who stand to lose the absolute most. And the working women, the grassroots women that I spoke to last week, they can tell you, they couldn't tell you about big oil, but they could tell you where it's hitting their pockets. And, one of the women from Madhya, where we asked about fish, she was like, girl, I can't even tell you what fish costs because I don't even walk near the fish in the market. I can't even afford to look at it, let alone. So I can't even tell you what fish costs. And the adjustments they have to make, they're fully aware of the ways in which they're being left out of this new dispensation. Politics these days is it's a vocation for folks who want to get rich. It's a business, and something has to be done to address that. But we probably need a number of other sessions to engage that.
Excellent. So that was Alyssa Trotz, and thank you very much for sharing all of your insights and ideas with us this afternoon. I'll now go to Arif Bulkan to offer his responses, closing remarks, and thoughts with us.
Thank you, Sarah. And I share Alyssa's view that your response to Dave was spot on. And Dave, I hear your frustration. I hear you saying that we know these problems, so what do we do? And but the thing that I have been trying to say for the past hour is that I don't think we appreciate our problems. I really don't. I think we say that we know the system is like this, and we know that there's this polarization, but we don't appreciate the extent to which our legal and constitutional system is structured in such a way that it stifles all hope of civil society. What I've been trying to say is that because there is this constitutional structure in which there's such an enormous executive influence on the society, because there's this maximum leader, everything else is swallowed up. And we see this at every iteration. And but to end on a hopeful note, I think Kalina is spot on, and Janet, and this is the note that we ended on in the paper, that we're not going to get delivery from the PNC or the PPP. We are only going to get that ourselves. So it has to be done at a local level. I think the local system is probably as compromised, the formal system. So I think in communities, in conversations like this, and take, well, not necessarily this, but in conversations and in action and among ourselves. I mean, like at the community level, in your street and in your community, and with your with the folk who are actually doing the work of living there, the fishermen and the women and so on. So, let me just end up by saying that while I think we keep saying that we know that this is the problem, civil society in Guyana has always been under siege. People are afraid to speak. The costs of critique can be draconian. I mean, some have paid the ultimate price. Many others are, very concerned about the financial and other costs to your job or to your reputation. The level of debate is so low. So I think the only way that can change, and the only way that the only way we can escape from that kind of domineering influence is if we have a system in which there's greater inclusivity. Yes, and less opportunity for a very powerful state to exercise all these coercive powers on us. So I think we can't escape the law. Thank you, Sarah.
No, thank you very much. I mean, I feel very inspired. I know I have another fellow youth online here with us this afternoon. And what really hit me just now, Arif, and this is before I hand to Isabel to close us out with her final remarks, it's that we in Guyana don't really appreciate our problems, right? So it's not that we don't want to get from just talking about the problems to get into solutions. It's just that some of us, we've spent so long just avoiding it, blocking it out, escaping it in various ways, that we have not examined it sufficiently to arrive at the type of solutions that could work. And the note I'd like to end on this afternoon, and Dave, I completely felt Dave Modest when he said, listen, we cannot handle this thing linearly, because if we handle it linearly, then, we might blow up half of the coast while we're still trying to fix the electoral system, God forbid, or some other disaster is gonna happen while we're focused on another issue. And there's so many things for us to address, and so little capacity. The people who are focused and dedicated and passionate about addressing these things in an unbiased, objective way are few, and we have to spread ourselves thin very often. But this afternoon, I am happy to hear that we have people both in Guyana and within the diaspora who are willing to walk the mile, not just talk the talk, but you're willing to walk the mile. And I know that once we get more people concentrating on the various issues, we can work on solutions simultaneously. And I'll give you a personal example. Before I switched to working in democracy, rights, and governance programming in 2019, I was actually working in conservation. And the reason I decided to work in conservation was because, listen, the clock is ticking. We're not doing things well. There are so many things I can say about the need to mitigate the climate crisis. And I felt that that was where my skills could be best applied at the time. But then we were ticking closer to the 2020 elections, and listening to people on the ground, I said, hold up, Sarah. You cannot be hiding in nature with the type of skills you have. You have to make this decision to skip across and go work in the realm of democracy and governance, because that is now where your skills are going to be most valuable. And really, if you talk to a conservationist, they'll tell you, Sarah, well, what you're going to do with democracy and an electoral system? If the earth dies on us, we'll all be dead and there'll be no need to govern us, right? And that is a valid question. And the bottom line is there are too few people and too many issues, and we need more solutions than we're generating right now. And I think conversations like these, at least for me, it's helped me to deepen my understanding of the situation, and I stand more ready to design solutions, hopefully that will be more meaningful to Guyana and Guyanese people. Alyssa, I see you unmuted, so I'll let you go before and hand to Isabel.
It's just one little thing. I put this in the chat, but actually I wanted to say, and it could open up a whole can of worms, but maybe we can have a session dedicated. I think what all Guyanese should be calling for is a national inquiry into the oil contract. This goes all the way back to 1999, straight through. It cuts across political party, it cuts across individuals, let us get to the bottom of how these oil contracts were negotiated, how these production sharing agreements were negotiated, and let us put all of our politicians under the spotlight. As Guyanese, this should be a national civic duty that we should all be able to come together across political party, across race. This is not against any one government or the other, any one party or the other. Folks want to put it that way. We are asking for the oil contract to be opened up for all Guyanese. This is our, as Vanda said, this is our patrimony. These are our resources, and Guyanese people have a right to know what went down in their names. And that, I think, is something that we perhaps could and should call for as a movement that brings Guyanese together across difference to call for.
Excellent, thank you. So folks, my name is Sarah Barrett. It was a pleasure being your moderator this afternoon or this evening, depending on your time zone. And I would now like to hand you over to the trustee chair of Moray House Trust, Isabel DeCaries, to close us out. Isabel, the floor is yours.
So really, all I want to do is thank yourself, Alyssa, and Arif very much for a slightly experimental session, but hopefully I think a useful one. As we've said many times, we don't enter into these feeling that we are offering neat solutions, and we often walk away with more questions than we started with at the beginning. But I think that is part of the process of a maturing discourse. And so I think it's a valuable exercise. Thank you to the audience for chipping in with their comments and questions. And we look forward to many more. I think this has been useful. It's thrown up some actual concrete proposals. It's maybe also questioned some that are seen as concrete proposals, and that is a useful exercise as well. And hopefully it will inspire some of you who may not have already to go and read the paper. And thank you very much, particularly to Arif and Alyssa. It's always good to have academics willing to engage and willing to actually defend their thesis, as it were. So enough respect. Thank you, and thank you to our audience.